Jisoo rubbed her eyes, stifling a yawn. The bus rumbled through the deserted city streets, its dim lights doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness outside. Each jolt sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of cold and exhaustion gnawing at her. It had been a long day, the kind that left you feeling like a deflated balloon. All she wanted was to crawl into bed and forget about the mountain of paperwork waiting on her desk. She glanced at her watch, the luminous hands mocking her with their slow progress. It was past midnight, the usual bustling city now reduced to an eerie tableau of shadows and silence. Most of the seats around her were empty, the only other passengers a scattering of figures huddled deep in their coats, faces obscured by the dim light. A sudden chill snaked down her back, sending goosebumps erupting on her arms. It felt like someone was watching her. She tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to her frayed nerves and the late hour. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. She risked a glance around the bus, her heart pounding in her chest. There, in the back row, a pair of eyes glinted in the darkness. The eyes seemed to bore into her, their intensity sending a jolt of fear through her. Jisoo couldn't make out the face, shrouded as it was in shadows, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. It was a predatory gaze, cold and calculating, sending shivers down her spine. She quickly averted her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest. "Don't look," she told herself, trying to control the tremor in her hands. "Just ignore it. Maybe he's just tired. Maybe he's not even looking at you." But even as she tried to rationalize the situation, a primal fear coiled in the pit of her stomach. The eyes felt different. Wrong, somehow, like those of an animal stalking its prey. Her senses were on high alert, every fiber of her being screaming at her to get away. The bus lurched to a stop, snapping her out of her fear-stricken paralysis. This was her stop. Relief washed over her, tinged with a growing sense of dread. She quickly gathered her belongings and made her way to the exit, her steps faster than usual. As she stepped off the bus, she couldn't shake off the feeling that the eyes were still on her, watching her every move. The night air was thick with a damp chill that seeped into her bones. Jisoo hurried down the deserted street, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced menacingly with every gust of wind. She couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled upon her since she first noticed the man on the bus. It was as if the darkness itself had become something sinister, something to be feared. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a nearby sign sent her heart racing. Turning a corner into her street, Jisoo thought she saw a figure disappear into the shadows of a narrow alleyway. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be, could it? Was she being followed? She quickened her pace, her heart pounding against her ribs. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, a primal warning screaming at her to run. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but the darkness behind her held nothing but the faint glow of distant streetlights. A wave of relief washed over her, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. It must have been her imagination, a trick of the light and shadows playing on her already frayed nerves. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, an unwelcome companion on her walk home. Up ahead, a beacon of fluorescent light cut through the darkness. The familiar glow of the 24/7 convenience store beckoned her with the promise of safety and a temporary reprieve from the unnerving darkness. She crossed the street, her pace brisk, eager to reach the sanctuary of its brightly lit interior. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, the warmth of the store washing over her like a physical embrace. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping slightly as some of the tension left her body. Glancing at the lone clerk behind the counter, who seemed more engrossed in a magazine than in serving customers, she made her way to the back of the store to grab a bottle of water. As she reached for a bottle on the shelf, a movement outside caught her eye. There, standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadows, was the figure from the bus. He was just standing there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the store. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and predatory. Panic surged through her, icy and paralyzing. She froze, her hand hovering over the water bottles, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation, to find a way out. "Excuse me," she called out to the clerk, her voice trembling slightly. "That man outside, he was on the bus with me. He seems to be following me." The clerk barely glanced up from his magazine. "He's not bothering anyone, is he?" He mumbled, his tone disinterested. "He's probably just waiting for someone." Jisu's blood ran cold, but she started to protest, but the words caught in her throat. The clerk wasn't even listening. He had already gone back to his magazine, dismissing her concerns with a disinterested wave of his hand. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to get home, to the supposed safety of her apartment. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the first bottle of water she could reach and practically threw the money at the clerk. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat urging her to move. She practically ran out of the store, her eyes darting around frantically. The figure across the street was gone. Relief warred with terror as Jisu fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the lock. Finally, the door swung open and she practically fell inside, slamming the door shut behind her and bolting it with a resounding thud. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the streetlights filtering in through the window at the end of the hall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She flipped on the light switch, but the overhead fixture remained stubbornly dark. Of course, she thought, her heart sinking. The power had to go out now. Fumbling in her purse for her phone, she used its feeble light to navigate her way down the hallway, her heart pounding with every step. As she passed the mirror on the wall, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. Reflected in the dim light of her phone was a figure standing behind her. It was him, the man from the bus. Terror, pure and consuming, shot through her. She whirled around, her mouth open in a silent scream, but the hallway behind her was empty. There was no one there. She spun back to the mirror, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to erupt from her throat. The figure in the mirror was gone too. Had she imagined it? Had the fear finally pushed her over the edge? A cold dread settled over her, gripping her in its icy embrace. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor with a sickening thud. She stood there, frozen in place, her mind reeling from the impossible. Then she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible chuckle coming from somewhere behind her. It was close, too close. It seemed to slither around her, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. Her blood ran cold, her body refusing to obey her commands to move, to run. She was trapped, a prey caught in the sights of an unseen predator. The chuckle grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural laugh that seemed to reverberate through her bones. It was a sound that promised pain, that hinted at a darkness far deeper than she could have ever imagined. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the mirror, its surface rippling like water, the reflection within no longer her own.